Prepare for battle! Virtua Fighter is the game that launched the genre of 3D fighting games. As a revolutionary arcade game, it showed the world what the next generation would bring and was the launch system seller for the Sega Saturn and also the Sega 32X, but yeah, Sega want to forget that one. It was the game that made you realise you had to upgrade from the Mega Drive to Sega's 32-bit hardware. Now, it's obvious to say that the Mega Drive owners therefore wouldn't get Virtua Fighter to play on the aging 16-bit workhorse. So how is it that Virtua Fighter 2 found its way to the Mega Drive? And more importantly, is it any good? I've recently looked at the Sega Game Gear Virtua Fighter game, which is known either as Virtua Fighter Mini or Virtua Fighter Animation, and was made to tie in an anime based on the arcade game. Virtua Fighter was the big new Sega franchise, and it made sense to put a game on the Game Gear to build the brand and also scratch that Virtua Fighter itch for players when they couldn't play it at home or in the arcades. More surprising than a Game Gear spin-off from Virtua Fighter is the straight-up demake of Virtua Fighter 2 on the Mega Drive. Whilst this may not be as good as the Sega Saturn release of Virtua Fighter 2, I can say that in the late 1990s when I got this, I was beyond satisfied to have the latest Saturn fighting game on my humble Sega Mega Drive. Yes, just like Virtua Fighter Mini, Sega have worked hard to be creative to give the illusion that this is still a 3D fighting game as the original is and retain the core gameplay. The stages you fight on look 3D, with its ground level moving to give you the sense that this still takes place on a 3D stage like the arcade and Sega Saturn games. The trees and objects in the background also add to this illusion, as they really do retain the look of the janky old texture-mapped 3D objects of the day. The way the ground shakes and changes perspective slightly was impressive for the Mega Drive. The characters though, yeah, they of course are not created in 3D and are instead 2D sprites that can only fight in a 2D plane and can't be viewed from any other angles or rotated around like they could on the arcade game. This actually puts the game in a slightly weird position. Now, when many people look at early 3D games, they'll say that they haven't aged as well as 2D games that came before them. The likes of Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 1 through 3 are generally seen as being easier on the eye in a modern context compared to the first 3D iterations like Street Fighter X Plus Alpha and Mortal Kombat 4. In the case of Virtua Fighter, it's the game that originated the 3D fighting genre, and although there was artwork of the characters that was traditionally drawn, the only way people have memories of playing this as the characters was in the 3D form. This demake arguably has aged better graphically than the more advanced versions of Virtua Fighter at the arcade, and especially the 32X and Saturn versions of Virtua Fighter 1. I wouldn't say that this sprite work in Virtua Fighter 2 on the Genesis is awesome compared to the likes of Street Fighter 2, but does the job to replicate the more detailed look of the characters from the arcade game. The game features a slightly smaller roster than the arcade and Saturn versions of Virtua Fighter 2 and basically cuts the new roster additions that were brought in to Virtua Fighter 2 after the first game. Apparently, this game was originally in development as a Mega Drive version of Virtua Fighter Animation that launched on the Game Gear, and so probably would have been something of an adaptation of that, and more of a version of the first game, just as Virtua Fighter Animation / Virtua Fighter Mini is. That basically is Virtua Fighter 1, but kind of then based on the anime. But when they were making this, Clearly they were like, this is good enough to make it a version of Virtua Fighter 2, and also tie into that name. In the game, you can play as Akira, Pei, Lou, Wolf, Jeffrey, Cage, Jacky, Sarah, and the unlockable final boss, Dural. Lion and Shun Di from the arcade and Saturn versions are, as I said, cut. But like I said, these were new characters introduced in Virtua Fighter 2, and they were probably less cut as never considered for inclusion. Look, if this was to be a version of Virtua Fighter animation, they weren't going to be included, and I suspect that at some point, like I said, Sega decided that the game would do better if it was named Virtua Fighter 2, and seemed like a full release rather than being a spin-off. And that probably explains why they cut the story screens from Virtua Fighter animation. The Game Gear game has the story screens, which you don't get in the arcade games, and then you don't get them on this either. So this is why it is presented closer to being like the arcade game than like the anime spin-off. Gameplay wise, this still very much feels like Virtua Fighter 2, but perhaps with a cut down moveset. The moves you can pull off still play the same, but the animation is a bit jerky looking as you pull out wrestling style moves, in particular, like if you do a power bomb or a big swing, playing as someone like Jeffrey, anyone that does big throws, it doesn't look silky smooth on the animation front. As a sign of the chaos that was Sega during the transitional period between the 16-bit and 32-bit generations, gamers could play Virtua Fighter 1 on either the Sega Saturn or the Mega Drive 32X. But if they fell on the Mega Drive owner side of things, they would go from the full 3D original to the 2D Demake of the sequel, which ironically had more detailed graphics on the characters and stages as a result of being 2D. So what are your memories of playing Virtua Fighter 2 for the Mega Drive, aka the Genesis? I really enjoyed playing it, although it'd be something I'd only crack out occasionally, or I might play occasionally in multiplayer mode with a sibling, but it wasn't something where I felt like I had to keep going back to it and was addicted to doing it, as every character like you would, perhaps something like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. It's a good game on the Mega Drive, but it's not the greatest game ever, and it's certainly not as exciting as playing it in 3D on the Saturn. So that is going to wrap things up for this review of Virtua Fighter 2 for the Mega Drive. If you haven't done so already, I would appreciate if you would smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel. Do check out the channel. Like I said, I had a review of Virtua Fighter Mini for the Sega Game Gear about maybe a month ago. It's on there on the channel. I'll put a link in the description. Also go over to www.xstreamed.tv/gaming if you want the written article version of today's discussion, and do check out everything else I've got going on the channel: hardware reviews, documentaries. I've had a recent series all about the Street Fighter games if you are into your fighting game genre. And with that, until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're off the air.